She writes, "My father was lying there unconscious. The stroke had been severe. He'd lost his speech and his right side was paralyzed. He opened his eyes several times, but his gaze was clouded and no one knew whether he recognized anybody or not. Whenever he opened his eyes, they leaned over him, straining to catch a word or even read a wish in his eyes. I was sitting at his side holding his hand, and he looked at me, though I'm sure he couldn't see me. I kissed his face and his hand. There was no longer anything more for me to do." It's a strange thing, but during those days of illness when he was nothing but a body out of which the soul had flown, and later during the days of leave-taking in the Hall of Columns. The Hall of Columns, by the way, is this big kind of palace where Soviet dignitaries lie in state, and where Stalin laid in state for some time. And she obviously was there at that time. She said, "I love my father more dearly at that time than I ever had before. Neither before nor since have I felt such a powerful welling up of strong, contradictory emotions. As I stood in the Hall of Columns day after day, frozen, unable to speak, I literally stood, for try as they would to make me sit down, or even though they shoved a chair under me, I was unable to sit or do anything but stand in the presence of what was occurring. I realized that a deliverance of some kind was underway. I had no idea what kind of deliverance it was or what form it was going to take, but I knew that for me and for everyone else, it would be a release from a burden that had been weighing on the minds and hearts of us all. They were playing an old Georgian folk tune with a melody that was sorrowful and full of feeling. I looked at that face in its sadness and repose and listened to the funeral music and felt torn apart by grief. I thought what a bad daughter I had been, that I'd been more like a stranger than a daughter and had never been a help to this lonely spirit, this sick old man, when he was left all alone on his Olympus. Yet he was, after all, my father, a father who had done his best to love me and to whom I owed good things as well as bad. All those days I couldn't cry and I didn't eat. Grief and a sort of calm had turned me to stone." And then she writes these terrible words about her father's death, looking back before that point when her father had actually died. She writes, "My father died a difficult and terrible death. It was the first and so far the only time I had seen somebody die. God grants an easy death only to the just." It's remarkable words. The hemorrhaging had gradually spread to the rest of the brain. Since his heart was healthy and strong, it affected the breathing centers bit by bit and caused suffocation. His breathing became shorter and shorter. For the last 12 hours, the lack of oxygen was acute. His face altered and became dark. His lips turned black and the features grew unrecognizable. The last hours were nothing but a slow strangulation. The death agony was horrible. He literally choked to death as we watched. At what seemed like the very last moment, he suddenly opened his eyes and cast a glance over everyone in the room. It was a terrible glance, insane or perhaps angry and full of the fear of death and the unfamiliar faces of the doctors bent over him. The glances swept over everyone in a second. Then something incomprehensible and awesome happened that to this day I can't forget and don't understand. He suddenly lifted his left hand as though he were going to point to something above and bring down a curse on us all. The gesture was incomprehensible and full of menace, and no one could say to whom or at what it might be directed. The next moment, after a final effort, the spirit wrenched itself free from the flesh. I thought I was about to suffocate too, and I clutched the hand of a young woman doctor who was standing next to me. She started moaning from pain, and we held on tightly to one another. The spirit had flown. The flesh grew still. The face became pale and assumed its usual appearance.